Officer Callahan's boots hit the pavement before the cruiser's engine even stopped running, and the first thing he saw was the wall of people standing back, not moving forward. That wasn't normal. When a crowd gathers around a child, they press in, they try to help. But this crowd was frozen at a distance, and in the center of that strange circle sat a little girl on the edge of the playground sandbox, so small her feet didn't touch the ground, and beside her, planted like a monument of muscle and fury, was Tank. His canine partner wasn't barking. That was almost worse. Tank's body was coiled, his head low, ears forward, and every line of him radiated a message that needed no sound. Come closer and find out what happens next. Callahan had worked with Tank for 4 years, had seen the dog face down armed suspects and chase runners through chain link in darkness, and he had never seen Tank position himself like this. The dog wasn't guarding evidence. He wasn't holding a perimeter. He was protecting the girl from everyone, including the 2 paramedics standing 10 feet away with their med kits open and their hands raised in frustration. "Officer, we need to assess her," the taller paramedic said, his voice tight. "But that dog won't let us within 6 feet. We tried twice. He doesn't bite, doesn't lunge, he just moves between us and blocks. And the growl he gives," the man trailed off, shaking his head. "It's not aggression, it's a warning, like he knows something we don't." Callahan scanned the scene, his gut tightening. The girl, maybe 6 years old, dark hair tangled around her face, eyes locked on the ground, was completely silent. Not crying, not calling for help, just sitting there with her hands folded in her lap, trembling so faintly that most people probably couldn't even see it. But Callahan saw it, and he knew Tank saw it too. The dog's front paws were planted in the sand, less than a foot from her knees, his body angled to cover her from the growing crowd of concerned parents and park staff pressing in from the fence line. "Has she said anything?" Callahan asked, stepping forward slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Anything at all?" A woman in a windbreaker, maybe a park supervisor, shook her head. "Not a word. We found her 20 minutes ago sitting right there. Thought she was just waiting for a parent, but no one claimed her. When we tried to ask her name, she looked at us like—" the woman hesitated, her face going pale, "like she was terrified we'd touch her. Then your dog showed up with the first responders and took that position, and now no one can get close." Callahan's chest tightened. Tank had arrived with the fire department's community response unit, standard protocol when a child was reported alone. But Tank hadn't waited for commands. He'd moved on instinct, reading something in the girl that every human in this park had missed. Dogs didn't do that without cause, especially not dogs like Tank, who'd been trained to distinguish between threat and fear, between danger to others and danger from others. If Tank was holding this line, it was because he believed the girl needed it held. Callahan crouched low, still 15 feet back, and met Tank's eyes. The dog's gaze flicked to him for half a second. Acknowledgement, not submission, then returned to the crowd. That look told Callahan everything. Tank wasn't confused. He wasn't overreacting. He was doing exactly what he thought the job required, and he wasn't going to stop until the threat, whatever it was, had been neutralized. "All right, buddy," Callahan murmured, mostly to himself. "Let's figure out what you're seeing." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice just enough to carry. "Everyone back, please. Give us space. If you saw anything before this, anyone with the girl, anyone nearby acting strange, stay close. Otherwise, I need you to clear the area." Parents began to shuffle their kids toward the parking lot, and the wall of onlookers thinned. The paramedics didn't move. They were waiting for permission to do their job, and Callahan didn't blame them. But he also wasn't going to override Tank without understanding what was happening first. Slowly, Callahan rose and walked a careful arc toward the sandbox, angling so he wasn't coming straight at the girl. Tank's head swiveled to track him, but the dog didn't growl. That was permission. Callahan stopped 8 feet away and knelt again, this time low enough that he was below the girl's eye line. She still hadn't looked up. Her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were bone white, and her breathing, shallow, controlled, like she was trying not to be noticed at all. "Hey," Callahan said gently, his voice barely above a conversation tone. "My name's Officer Callahan. The dog you see there, that's Tank. He's my partner, and he's really good at knowing when someone needs a friend." He paused, watching for any reaction. The girl didn't move, but her shoulders tightened. She'd heard him. "Tank's not going to let anyone bother you right now. He's made that pretty clear. But I need to know, are you hurt? Can you tell me your name?" Nothing. Not even a blink. But her breathing quickened, just a fraction, and Callahan saw her eyes dart sideways toward Tank without lifting her head. The dog didn't move, but his ears swiveled back slightly, listening to her, not Callahan. It was such a subtle shift that most people would have missed it, but Callahan had watched Tank work for years. The dog was synced to the girl now, reading her the way he'd read a suspect's body language, or the scent trail of someone lost in the woods. Callahan's mind raced. A child this silent, this frozen, wasn't just scared. This was something else. Training, conditioning. The kind of fear that didn't come from strangers or accidents. The kind that came from someone close. Someone who'd taught her that speaking, moving, reacting, any of it, carried consequences. One of the paramedics shifted his weight, and Tank's head snapped toward the movement, lips pulling back just enough to show teeth. The paramedic froze. "Easy," Callahan said quietly, holding up a hand. "No one moves. Not yet." He turned back to the girl, forcing his voice to stay soft. "You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to talk to anyone. But Tank, he's not going to leave until he knows you're okay. That's his job, and he's really, really good at it." The girl's fingers twitched. It was so small Callahan almost missed it. But Tank saw it, and the dog's posture shifted again just slightly, lowering his head an inch closer to her. Not threatening, inviting. The girl's eyes finally lifted from the ground, not to Callahan, not to the paramedics, but to Tank. And for the first time since Callahan had arrived, he saw something in her expression that wasn't just fear. It was recognition. She knew what Tank was doing. She understood that he was the wall between her and whatever, or whoever, she'd been taught to be afraid of. And in that moment, Callahan felt the weight of what they were dealing with settle over him like a lead blanket. This wasn't a lost child. This was a child who'd been told in some way he didn't yet understand that she couldn't be found. And Tank, with his instincts honed by thousands of hours of training and a bond deeper than commands, had sensed it the moment he'd laid eyes on her. Callahan pulled his radio from his belt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need detectives and child services at Riverside Park immediately. We have a possible endangered juvenile, non-responsive, no injuries visible. Advise ETA." He released the button and looked back at the girl, then at Tank. The dog hadn't moved. He wasn't going to. Whatever had brought this little girl to this playground, alone and silent, Tank had decided it wasn't over yet. Dispatch came back with a crackle. "Unit 12, detectives en route, ETA 18 minutes, child services notified, supervisor responding. Do you need additional backup?" Callahan kept his eyes on the girl, watching the way her gaze stayed locked on Tank, the way her breathing was still too controlled, too quiet. "Negative on backup. Scene is secure. Just need specialists." He clipped the radio back and let out a slow breath, his mind rewinding through the last 2 hours, trying to piece together how they'd ended up here. It had started as the most routine kind of call, the kind that usually turned out to be nothing. He and Tank had been finishing a patrol loop through the east side, windows down, late afternoon sun, cutting through the trees along Riverside, when the radio squawked with a community welfare check. Possible abandoned child at the park, called in by a jogger who'd passed twice and seen no adult nearby. Callahan had acknowledged and turned the cruiser toward the park entrance, Tank already sitting up in the back compartment, ears pricked. The dog always knew when a call was different. Always. They'd arrived to find exactly what the jogger described, a small figure sitting alone on a bench near the playground, no parents in sight, no one approaching her. Callahan had parked and stepped out, scanning the area. Midweek, mid-afternoon. The park wasn't crowded, but there were people. A couple walking a dog near the pond, a man tossing a frisbee in the open field, A woman pushing a stroller along the path. Normal, unremarkable. But the girl on the bench, she was an island in the middle of it all, and no one seemed to be looking at her. Callahan had opened the back of the cruiser and let Tank out on lead, standard procedure for a welfare check involving a minor. Tank had trotted beside him, calm and focused, the way he always was on approach. But the moment they'd closed within 30 feet of the bench, Tank's entire body had changed. His stride shortened, his head dropped, his nostrils flared, pulling in scent, and Callahan had felt the lead go taut as the dog slowed, processing something Callahan couldn't see or smell or hear. "Easy, Tank," Callahan had said quietly, letting the lead out a little, giving the dog room to work. Tank had moved forward in careful steps, not rushing, not retreating, and when they'd reached the bench, the girl hadn't looked up. She'd been wearing a faded blue jacket 2 sizes too big, her hands tucked into the sleeves, her sneakers scuffed and dirty. Her hair fell across her face in uneven tangles, and she was so still that for a horrible second, Callahan had thought she might be hurt, unconscious, something worse. "Hey there," he'd said, keeping his voice soft. "I'm Officer Callahan. Are you okay? Where's your mom or dad?" No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Callahan had crouched down, trying to get on her level, and that's when Tank had stepped between them, not aggressive, not sharp, just a smooth, deliberate repositioning that put the dog's body in the space Callahan had been about to occupy. Callahan had frozen, confused. Tank didn't block him. They'd trained for thousands of hours to work as a unit, to move in sync, and this was the dog overriding him. "Tank?" Callahan had straightened slightly, watching the dog's posture. Tank's eyes weren't on Callahan anymore. They were on the girl, and his head was low, ears forward, the way he looked when he was scenting for something specific. Explosives, narcotics, blood. But there was nothing here. Just a kid on a bench. Callahan had looked at her again, closer this time, and that's when he'd seen the trembling. The way her fingers were knotted together inside those 2 long sleeves. The way her breathing was shallow and rhythmic, like she was counting it. The way her eyes, barely visible through the curtain of hair, were open but unfocused, staring at the ground like she was trying to disappear into it. Callahan's stomach had tightened. He'd seen trauma responses before. He'd pulled kids out of bad homes, bad situations, bad nights that left marks you couldn't photograph. But this was different. This girl wasn't crying for help. She wasn't running or hiding or lashing out. She was obeying something, some instruction, some rule that had been drilled into her so deeply she couldn't break it even when she was alone and afraid. Tank had sat then, right beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched her knee, and the dog hadn't moved since. When the fire department's community unit had arrived, Tank had growled. When the paramedics had approached, Tank had stood and blocked. When park staff had tried to coax the girl with kind words and promises of safety, Tank had positioned himself like a barrier. And Callahan had realized with cold clarity that the dog wasn't protecting the girl from danger. He was protecting her from everyone. Because Tank had sensed what Callahan was only starting to understand. This girl had been taught that adults were the threat, that speaking, responding, reaching out, any of it, would trigger consequences she'd learned to fear more than being alone. Now, standing in the sandbox with the paramedics waiting, and the crowd dispersed, and the sun starting to dip behind the trees, Callahan felt the full weight of that realization settling over him. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had wrapped her in this invisible prison of silence and obedience, they'd done it with precision, with repetition, with control that went deeper than a single bad day or a single bad moment. He knelt again, this time angling his body so he wasn't facing the girl directly, so he wasn't a wall or a challenge or another adult demanding something from her. Instead, he faced Tank, and he spoke to the dog, letting his voice carry just loud enough for the girl to hear. "You see something I don't, buddy. You wouldn't hold this line if it wasn't important. So we're gonna wait. We're gonna let her decide when she's ready. No one's going to rush her. No one's going to grab her. She's safe now. You made sure of that." Tank's ears swiveled toward Callahan, then back to the girl. The dog's breathing was steady, calm, but his eyes, They stayed locked on her, tracking every micro-movement, every shift in her body language. And then, so quietly, Callahan almost missed it, the girl made a sound. Not a word, not a cry, just a breath. A little longer, a little deeper, like she'd been holding it for hours. And finally, her body was allowing her to let go. Callahan's throat tightened. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stayed there, kneeling in the sand beside his partner, and waited. Because Tank had been right from the beginning. This wasn't a situation you could command your way through. This wasn't a door you could kick open or a suspect you could corner. This was a child who'd been taught that the world was full of traps, and the only way to reach her was to prove, inch by inch, breath by breath, that at least one corner of that world was different. That at least here, with Tank standing guard and Callahan holding the line, she didn't have to be afraid of what came next. Callahan waited, counting his own breaths, watching the girl's shoulders rise and fall in that same careful rhythm. She'd made a sound, just one, but it had been voluntary, not forced, and that was more than anyone else had gotten from her in the last hour. Tank remained motionless beside her, his presence a solid anchor in a situation that felt like it could shatter at the slightest wrong move. Callahan knew he had maybe one chance to bridge the gap before the detectives arrived, and the whole scene shifted into something more formal, more procedural, more likely to trigger whatever defenses this child had been taught to deploy. He shifted his weight slightly, settling into a more comfortable kneel, and spoke again, still directing his words toward Tank, but letting them float into the space the girl occupied. You know what Tank does when someone's scared? He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't need to know why. He just stays. That's his whole job, staying right where you need him until you don't need him anymore. Callahan paused, glancing sideways without turning his head. He's pretty good at it. Best partner I've ever had. The girl's fingers twitched again, a little more visible this time, and her head tilted, not toward Callahan, but toward Tank. Her eyes, still mostly hidden behind the curtain of tangled hair, tracked the dog's profile. Callahan could see her taking in the details. The way Tank's ears swiveled to catch every sound, the steady rise and fall of the dog's ribs, the calm, unshakable presence that radiated from him like heat from pavement. She was reading Tank the way Tank had been reading her, and Callahan felt a flicker of hope. "Can I try something?" Callahan asked quietly, still not looking directly at her. "I'm not going to come closer. I'm not going to touch you. I just want to see if Tank can help us figure out what you need. Is that okay?" No answer. But her breathing didn't speed up, didn't hitch. That was permission, or at least it wasn't refusal. Callahan took it. He reached into his vest pocket slowly, pulling out a small notebook and a pen, the kind he used for field notes. He set them on the sand halfway between himself and the girl, close enough that she could reach them without getting up, far enough that he wasn't invading her space. "If you want to write something instead of saying it, you can," Callahan said. "Or you can draw, or you can just hold the pen. Whatever feels safe." He let the offer sit there, not pushing, not explaining further. The girl's eyes flicked toward the notebook, then back to Tank. Her lips parted slightly like she was testing the shape of words she wasn't ready to release, and then she closed them again, her jaw tightening. Tank's head lowered an inch, his nose dipping closer to her hands, and Callahan saw the girl's fingers uncurled just slightly, not reaching for the dog, but not pulling away either. It was the smallest gesture, barely a shift in tension, but Tank responded immediately. The dog leaned in, closing the last few inches between them, and rested his chin gently on the edge of the bench beside her knee, not demanding, offering. The girl's breath hitched, not in fear, in something else, relief maybe, or recognition. Her hand moved, slow and trembling, and her fingertips brushed the top of Tank's head, just once, feather light. Callahan's chest squeezed so hard he had to force himself to keep breathing normally. That touch, that tiny tentative connection, was the first time she'd reached for anything since he'd arrived. The first time she'd chosen to interact instead of retreating into silence. Tank didn't move, didn't push into the touch or pull away. He just held his position, letting the girl control the contact. And after a few seconds, her hand settled more firmly on his head, fingers curling into the short fur behind his ears. Callahan could see her shoulders dropping, the rigid line of her spine softening just a fraction. And he knew they were close to something. He just didn't know what yet. Tank likes that, Callahan said softly. He doesn't let just anyone pet him. Means he trusts you. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. That you're not going to hurt him. And I think, maybe he wants you to know he's not going to hurt you either. No matter what anyone told you, no matter what you're afraid might happen if you talk. The girl's hands stilled. Her breathing stopped for a beat, then restarted shakier than before. Callahan cursed himself silently. Too much, too direct, but he couldn't take it back now. He could only wait and hope he hadn't just shattered whatever fragile trust had started to form. The girl's head turned slightly, still not enough to see her face clearly, but enough that Callahan could tell she was looking at him now, or at least looking in his direction. Someone told you not to talk, didn't they? Callahan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone you know, someone who said bad things would happen if you did. The girl's hand tightened in Tank's fur, gripping hard enough that the dog's ears flicked back, and Callahan saw her whole body tense like a wire pulled taut. He'd hit it. Whatever the core of this was, he'd just stepped right into it, and now he had to decide whether to push forward or back off. Tank made the decision for him. The dog shifted his weight, pressing a little more firmly against the girl's leg, and let out a low, quiet huff. Not a growl, not a whine, just a sound that said, "I'm here, you're okay." The girl's lips moved. No sound came out, but Callahan could see her mouthing something, testing it, and then she leaned down, so close to Tank's ear that her hair fell across the dog's face, and she whispered. It was so quiet, Callahan couldn't hear the word. Couldn't even be sure she'd actually said it out loud. But Tank's ears snapped forward, his head lifting sharply, and the dog's entire body language shifted from protective to alert. Hunting mode, tracking mode. The shift was so sudden and so clear that Callahan's pulse spiked. Tank, what is it? Callahan leaned forward slightly, watching his partner's face. Tank turned his head toward Callahan, held his gaze for 2 seconds, then looked back toward the parking lot, toward the tree line beyond it. The dog's nostrils flared, pulling air, and Callahan felt ice slide down his spine. Tank had scented something, heard something, or the girl had given him a piece of information that changed everything. Callahan keyed his radio, keeping his voice low. Dispatch, Unit 12, I need you to pull any recent reports from Riverside Park, last 48 hours. Also run a check on any registered sex offenders or persons of interest within a 2-mile radius. Possible suspect may still be in the area. Static. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, sharper now. Copy, Unit 12. Stand by. Callahan released the button and turned back to the girl. She was staring at Tank now, her hands still buried in his fur, and her eyes, wide, wet, terrified, were finally visible through the tangles of hair. She looked at Callahan for the first time, really looked at him, and he saw the question there, the plea. What did you tell him? Callahan asked gently. What name did you say? The girl's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Her voice came out cracked and thin, like she'd forgotten how to use it. Kevin. One word, just one. But it landed like a gunshot in the quiet space between them. Kevin, Callahan repeated, his mind already racing. Not a stranger's name, not something generic. She knew him. Who's Kevin, sweetheart? Is he the one who brought you here? The girl nodded, so small and quick it was almost a flinch. Tank rumbled, a low vibration in his chest that Callahan felt more than heard. And the dog's eyes tracked the tree line again. Callahan followed the look, scanning the shadows between the oaks and maples, the parked cars in the lot, the paths winding away from the playground. Someone had been here. Someone the girl knew. Someone who'd left her alone and run when the patrol car showed up. "Dispatch, I need that data now," Callahan said into the radio, his voice tight. First name Kevin, last name unknown, possible family acquaintance or caretaker. He may still be watching the scene. The response was immediate. Unit 12, we have a Kevin Marsh, age 34, listed as an emergency contact for a Nora Finch, age 6, reported missing from her residence 40 minutes ago by her mother. Marsh is described as a family friend and regular babysitter. No priors, but stand by, pulling more. Nora. The girl had a name now. Callahan looked at her, at Nora, and saw the fear spike in her eyes when she heard her own name come through the radio. She tried to pull her hand back from Tank, but the dog shifted, keeping contact, keeping her grounded. Callahan's throat tightened. 40 minutes. She'd been missing for 40 minutes, which meant Marsh had taken her, brought her here, and abandoned her when he saw the police. But why? What had he done that made a 6-year-old girl so terrified of adults that she couldn't even speak? Tank turned his head sharply toward the north path, his body going rigid, and Callahan's hand dropped to his belt instinctively. Someone was moving out there, someone just beyond the tree line, in the space where the afternoon shadows were starting to stretch long and dark. Callahan's heart hammered against his ribs as he tracked the movement in the tree line, his hand resting on his radio, but not yet keying it. Tank's body had gone rigid, every muscle coiled, but the dog hadn't moved from Nora's side, and that told Callahan something crucial. Whatever Tank was sensing, whoever was out there, the threat wasn't immediate enough to pull him away from his primary mission. Everything else was secondary. "Stay with her," Callahan murmured, more to himself than to Tank, and he rose slowly from his crouch, his eyes never leaving the shadows between the trees. The movement had stopped. Whoever it was had either realized they'd been spotted or had retreated deeper into the cover of the woods. Callahan took 2 steps toward the tree line, then stopped, his instincts screaming at him not to leave Nora exposed. If Marsh was out there, if he was watching, the last thing Callahan wanted to do was create an opening. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 12. I have possible movement in the tree line north of the playground. Request backup for perimeter containment, silent approach. Suspect may be surveilling the scene." "Copy, Unit 12. Units en route. ETA 8 minutes. Stay on channel." 8 minutes. Callahan's jaw tightened. 8 minutes was a lifetime if Marsh decided to run, or worse, if he decided to come back for Nora. Callahan turned back toward the girl and saw her staring at him, her hand still gripping Tank's fur, her eyes wide and pleading. She knew. She knew who was out there, and she was terrified Callahan was going to leave her alone with that knowledge. "I'm not going anywhere," Callahan said quietly, moving back to his position beside Tank. "Neither is he. We're staying right here until you're safe. I promise." Nora's lips trembled, and for a moment Callahan thought she might speak again, might give him something more, but instead she turned her face back toward Tank and pressed her forehead against the dog's neck. Tank leaned into her, solid and unmoving, and Callahan felt a surge of gratitude for his partner that went beyond words. The dog understood what Callahan couldn't articulate, that this wasn't about chasing suspects or securing scenes. This was about holding space for a child whose entire world had been rigged with invisible traps. Callahan crouched again, lowering himself back to Nora's level, and spoke directly to her this time, his voice steady and calm. "Nora, I need to ask you something, and you don't have to answer out loud. You can nod or shake your head, okay? Just so I know." He waited, watching her profile. She didn't move. "Did Kevin tell you that talking to police would hurt your mom and dad?" The reaction was instant. Nora's entire body went rigid, her breathing stopped, and her hand clenched so hard in Tank's fur that the dog let out a soft whine. Callahan's stomach dropped. That was it. That was the core of the control. Marsh hadn't just threatened Nora. He'd weaponized her love for her parents, turned it into a cage she couldn't escape, even when she was alone and terrified. "Okay," Callahan said gently, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay, sweetheart. Listen to me. That's not true. Your mom and dad are safe. They're looking for you right now. And they're going to be so happy when we bring you home. Nothing you say to me, nothing you tell Tank, none of it will hurt them. Kevin told you that so you'd be too scared to ask for help. But you're not alone anymore. You have Tank. You have me. And we're not going to let Kevin get anywhere near you again. Nora's breathing restarted in shallow, uneven gasps, and Callahan saw tears sliding down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. She shook her head, small and frantic, and her voice came out choked and broken. He said if I told, they'd go away forever. He said I'd never see them again. Callahan's throat closed. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her into some kind of protective embrace, but he knew better. Touch right now would be a violation. Another adult imposing his will, no matter how kind the intention. Instead, he stayed where he was and let his voice carry the weight of the promise. He lied, Nora. Your parents are safe. I can call them right now. I can let you hear your mom's voice. Would that help? Nora's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Callahan's, and for the first time, he saw hope flicker in her expression. Fragile and desperate, but real. You can? I can, Callahan said, already pulling his phone from his belt. Dispatch, patch me through to the reporting party for Nora Finch. I need to speak with her mother immediately. There was a pause, static, then a woman's voice, shaking, frantic, barely holding together. Hello? Did you find her? Please tell me you found her. Callahan's chest tightened. He looked at Nora, whose entire body was trembling now, and he held the phone out slightly, close enough for her to hear, but not forcing it into her hands. Mrs. Finch, my name is Officer Callahan. I'm with Nora right now. She's safe. She's not hurt. But she needs to hear your voice. Can you tell her you're okay? There was a sob, loud and ragged, and then the woman's voice came through, thick with tears. Nora, baby, it's Mom. I'm okay. Dad's okay. We're coming to get you right now. You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong. I love you so much. Nora's face crumpled, and she reached for the phone with shaking hands. Callahan let her take it, watching as she pressed it to her ear and whispered, so quiet he almost couldn't hear, Mommy? The woman on the other end broke down completely, her sobs turning into words Callahan couldn't make out, and Nora curled over the phone, clutching it like a lifeline. Tank shifted closer, pressing his body against her legs, and Callahan had to look away for a moment, his own eyes burning. Whatever Marsh had built around this child, it was cracking. She was still terrified, still trapped in the fear he'd cultivated. But she was starting to believe there might be a way out. Callahan stood slowly, giving Nora space, and keyed his radio again. Dispatch, advise detectives to coordinate with the mother. I need a full statement on Kevin Marsh. How long he's had access, how often, any behavioral red flags. Also, get me surveillance from the park entrance cameras for the last 2 hours. If Marsh brought her here, I want his vehicle. Copy, Unit 12. Detectives are 10 minutes out. Park security is pulling footage now. Callahan scanned the tree line again. The movement hadn't returned, but his instincts were screaming that Marsh was still close. Men like him didn't just walk away. They watched, they waited, they looked for openings, for mistakes, for moments when the attention shifted and they could slip back in and reassert control. But Callahan wasn't going to give him that opening. Not while Tank was standing guard. Not while Nora was finally starting to break free of the silence Marsh had wrapped around her like barbed wire. Nora lowered the phone slowly, her face streaked with tears, and handed it back to Callahan. Her voice was still shaking, still barely audible, but there was something new in it, something that hadn't been there before. Strength. Fragile, yes, tentative, but real. He brought me here because I told my teacher I was scared. He said I broke the rules. He said he had to fix it before anyone figured it out. Callahan's blood went cold. Marsh hadn't panicked. He'd planned this. He'd taken Nora because she'd started to reach for help, and he'd brought her here to, what? Reinforce the fear? Isolate her further? Or worse, Callahan didn't let himself finish that thought. Marsh had run when the cruiser showed up, which meant he hadn't expected police, hadn't expected interference. And now he was out there somewhere, realizing his control was slipping, realizing Nora was talking, and that made him exponentially more dangerous. "Nora," Callahan said, crouching back down and meeting her eyes. "I need you to keep talking to Tank. Whisper to him if you want. Tell him anything you remember about where Kevin took you, what he said, what he did. Tank's really good at listening, and it helps him do his job. Can you do that?" Nora looked at Tank, then back at Callahan and nodded. She leaned close to the dog again, her lips moving against his ear, and Tank's body language shifted, ears forward, eyes sharp, processing every sound, every word. Callahan watched his partner work, watched the dog translate Nora's whispered confession into the focused alertness of a canine who'd just been given a mission, and he felt the pieces start to click into place. Marsh hadn't just conditioned Nora to stay silent. He'd isolated her so completely that she couldn't trust any adult. But he'd never accounted for Tank, never considered that a dog, with his instincts and training and unshakable loyalty, would become the bridge Nora needed to cross back into safety. And now, as Tank sat beside her and absorbed every detail she was finally brave enough to share, Callahan knew they were running out of time. Marsh was out there, watching, waiting. And Callahan was going to make damn sure that when backup arrived and the net closed, there was nowhere left for him to run. Callahan's radio crackled to life, cutting through the quiet tension of the playground. "Unit 12, Detective Rains responding. We're pulling into the north lot now. What's your status?" Callahan rose from his crouch, keeping his eyes on the tree line as he keyed the mic. "Victim is stable, talking, protected by my canine. I have reason to believe suspect Kevin Marsh may still be in the area, possibly surveilling from the woods north of the playground. Proceed with caution." "Copy that. We have 2 units circling the perimeter now. Park security just sent over camera footage. Stand by." Callahan glanced down at Nora, who had stopped whispering to Tank and was now watching him with wide, frightened eyes. The dog remained pressed against her, his body a solid wall between her and the world, and Callahan could see the way her hand was still buried in Tank's fur, anchoring herself to the one presence that had proven safe. He needed to keep her talking, keep her engaged, before the detectives arrived and the whole scene shifted into something that might trigger her back into silence. "Nora," Callahan said softly, "did Kevin drive you here? Do you remember what kind of car?" Nora hesitated, her lips pressing together, and then nodded slowly. "Blue, with scratches on the side. He said someone tried to steal it." Callahan's pulse quickened. "Good, that's really good. Did he park close, or did you walk from somewhere else?" "Close," Nora whispered, her voice barely audible. "By the trees. He said we had to talk about what I told my teacher. He said I was making things bad for everyone." Callahan's jaw tightened. Classic grooming language, turning the victim into the problem, making her believe she was responsible for the consequences of speaking up. He'd seen it before in child exploitation cases, but hearing it from a 6-year-old who'd been conditioned to believe her words could destroy her family, it made his blood boil. The radio crackled again. "Unit 12, Detective Rains. Security footage shows a blue sedan, older model, heavy body damage on the driver's side, entering the north lot approximately 2 hours ago. Registered to a Kevin Marsh. Vehicle is no longer in frame. Looks like he circled back out when your cruiser arrived." "Running the plates now." "Copy," Callahan responded, his mind racing. Marsh had fled the moment he'd seen the patrol car, which meant he'd been watching Nora the whole time. Watching to make sure she stayed silent, making sure his control held. But now that Nora was talking, now that she'd broken the primary rule he'd drilled into her, Marsh would be spiraling. Men like him didn't accept loss of control. They doubled down. They found new ways to reassert dominance, and that meant Marsh might come back. Callahan turned toward the parking lot as 2 unmarked sedans pulled in, Lights off, moving slowly. A tall woman in a blazer stepped out of the first car, her badge visible on her belt, and a younger officer in tactical gear emerged from the second. Detective Rains scanned the playground, her gaze locking onto Callahan, then dropping to Nora and Tank. Her expression shifted, softer, more careful, and she approached with her hands visible, no sudden movements. "Officer Callahan," she said quietly when she was close enough. "I'm Detective Rains. This is Officer Peck. We're here to help, but I need to know, can we approach, or is your canine going to hold the line?" Callahan looked down at Tank. The dog's ears were forward, tracking Rains, but he hadn't moved into a blocking stance. That was permission. Cautious, conditional, but permission. "He'll let you close if you move slow, and don't reach for her. She's been conditioned to fear adults. Tank's the only one she trusts right now." Rains nodded, her face grave, and took a few careful steps forward, stopping about 6 feet away. She crouched low, bringing herself to Nora's eye level, and her voice when she spoke was gentle, almost motherly. "Hi, Nora. My name is Sarah. I'm a detective, and my job is to make sure kids are safe. I heard you've been really brave today, talking to Tank and Officer Callahan. That takes a lot of courage." Nora didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. She watched Rains with the same wary, calculating look she'd given Callahan at the beginning, testing, measuring, trying to decide if this was another trap. Tank shifted slightly, his head turning toward Rains, and Callahan saw the dog's nostrils flare, reading the detective's body language and scent. After a moment, Tank's ears relaxed a fraction. He'd made his assessment. Rains was safe. "Nora," Rains continued, "I need to ask you some questions, but not right now. Right now I just need to know, do you want to see your mom? She's on her way here. She'll be here in about 5 minutes." Nora's face crumpled, and she nodded, tears spilling over again. "I want my mom." "Okay," Rains said, her voice steady and warm. "Then that's what we're going to do. We're going to wait right here with Tank until she arrives, and then you're going to go home. But first, I need Officer Callahan to tell me everything you told him, because we need to find Kevin and make sure he can't scare you anymore. Is that okay?" Nora looked at Tank, as if checking with the dog, and then nodded again. Rains stood slowly and gestured for Callahan to step aside with her. Callahan moved a few feet away, close enough to keep Nora in his line of sight, and lowered his voice. "She's been groomed," Callahan said quietly. "Marsh has been babysitting her for months, maybe longer. He's been using threats against her parents to keep her silent. Told her if she talked to any adult, her mom and dad would disappear forever. She finally broke today, told her teacher she was scared, and Marsh brought her here to fix it. He ran when I showed up, but I think he's still in the area. Tank's been tracking something in the tree line." Rains's expression darkened. "We pulled Marsh's background. No priors, but his employment history is spotty. A lot of short-term jobs involving kids, summer camps, after-school programs. Always leaves before anyone can run a deeper check. This isn't his first victim. I'd bet my badge on it." Callahan's stomach turned. "How long until we can pick him up?" "We have units canvassing now," Rains said. "His apartment's 15 minutes from here. If he went back there, we'll have him in custody within the hour. But if he's still watching," she trailed off, her eyes scanning the tree line, "then we need to move Nora out of here before he decides to do something desperate." "Agreed," Callahan said, "but she won't go with anyone except her mother, and I don't want Tank to leave her side until we're sure Marsh is contained." Rains nodded. "Then Tank stays with her. We'll escort her and her mother to the station, take a formal statement when she's ready, and keep them in protective custody until Marsh is in a cell." She paused, glancing back at Nora, who was still sitting with her hand in Tank's fur, her eyes locked on the dog's face. "That dog saved her life today. You know that, right?" Callahan looked at his partner, at the way Tank's entire body was angled toward Nora, protective and unwavering, and felt a surge of pride so fierce it made his chest ache. "He did his job, same as always." "No," Rains said quietly. "He did more than that. He saw what the rest of us missed. He gave her a way out when she couldn't find one herself." She turned back to Callahan, her expression serious. When this goes to trial, Tank's going to be a key part of the case. The fact that he positioned himself as a barrier, that he refused to let anyone force her to comply, that's evidence of the psychological control Marsh had over her. It proves she was operating under duress. Callahan nodded, the weight of it settling over him. Tank hadn't just protected Nora from physical harm. He'd protected her from the invisible prison Marsh had built around her, brick by brick, threat by threat, until she believed the only way to keep her family safe was to disappear into silence. A car pulled into the lot, moving fast, and a woman stumbled out before it even stopped fully. Nora's mother. She was running toward the playground, her face streaked with tears, and Nora saw her and let out a cry that cut straight through Callahan's chest. The girl tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and Tank moved instantly, bracing her with his body, holding her up until her mother reached her and pulled her into a crushing embrace. Callahan stepped back, giving them space, and watched as Nora buried her face in her mother's shoulder and sobbed. Finally releasing the fear and terror and confusion that Marsh had forced her to carry alone. Tank stayed close, his head resting against Nora's leg, and Callahan saw the way the girl's hand dropped down to rest on the dog's head, even as she clung to her mother. Raines's radio buzzed. "Detective, we have Marsh. Picked him up at his apartment. He's in custody." Callahan exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. It was over. Marsh was contained. Nora was safe. And Tank had done what he'd been trained to do, what his instincts had demanded, and had given a terrified child the one thing no adult could. The trust that came without conditions, without demands, without the weight of words she'd been taught to fear. The ambulance doors stood open in the hospital bay, pale fluorescent lights spilling across the pavement. But Nora refused to get out of the back until Tank climbed in beside her. The paramedics had tried, gently, carefully, with every reassurance they could offer. But the moment they'd reached for her at the playground, she'd pressed herself against her mother and shaken her head, her eyes searching frantically for the dog. Callahan had made the call without hesitation. Tank rode in the ambulance, stretched across the narrow floor between the stretcher and the side bench, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes locked on Nora's face the entire 10-minute drive. Now, as the hospital staff waited at the entrance with a wheelchair and a nurse holding a clipboard, Callahan watched Nora's mother crouch beside her daughter and whisper something too quiet to hear. Nora nodded, her hands still tangled in Tank's fur, and finally, slowly, allowed herself to be helped down onto the wheelchair. Tank jumped down after her without being commanded, his lead trailing loose in Callahan's hand, and positioned himself beside the wheelchair as if he'd been trained for exactly this. He hadn't. This was pure instinct, the same instinct that had held the line at the playground, that had refused to let anyone force Nora into compliance before she was ready. Detective Raines stepped up beside Callahan as they followed the group through the automatic doors into the bright, sterile hallways of the emergency wing. Her voice was low, meant only for him. "Marsh lawyered up the second we got him into the interview room. Didn't say a word. But we got a warrant for his apartment, and," she paused, her jaw tightening, "it's worse than we thought. He had recordings, hours of them, different kids, different locations. We're working with the FBI now to identify the others." Callahan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He'd known men like Marsh existed, predators who built entire systems of control, who operated in plain sight under the cover of trust and familiarity. But knowing it and seeing the evidence laid out in front of him were two very different things. "How many?" Callahan asked quietly. "At least 4 that we can identify so far," Raines said. "Maybe more." He kept detailed logs, names, ages, routines. He was hunting Callahan methodically. Nora wasn't the first, and if he hadn't run today, she wouldn't have been the last. Callahan's throat tightened. He looked ahead to where Nora sat in the wheelchair, her mother walking beside her with one hand on her shoulder and Tank pacing alongside like a shadow. That girl, that terrified, silent little girl on the bench, had been living inside a nightmare so carefully constructed that even her own parents hadn't seen it. Marsh had embedded himself in their lives, made himself indispensable, and then used that access to break their daughter down piece by piece until she believed speaking would destroy everything she loved. They reached the examination room, a small space with pastel walls and a pediatric exam table covered in paper. A doctor waited inside, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, and she smiled gently at Nora as the wheelchair rolled to a stop. "Hi there, sweetheart," the doctor said, her voice soft. "My name is Dr. Patel. I'm just going to check to make sure you're okay. Nothing scary, I promise. Your mom's going to stay right here with you the whole time." Nora's eyes darted to Tank, then back to the doctor, and her grip on the dog's fur tightened. Dr. Patel noticed immediately. She glanced at Callahan, then at Tank, and her expression shifted. Understanding, accommodating. "Is that your friend?" she asked Nora. "What's his name?" Nora's voice was barely a whisper. "Tank." "Tank," Dr. Patel repeated, nodding seriously. "That's a very strong name. Do you think Tank would like to stay with you while I do the exam? We can have him sit right there, by the table, so you can see him the whole time." Nora looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at Tank. After a long moment, she nodded too. Callahan felt a swell of relief, so intense it almost made him dizzy. He stepped forward, guiding Tank to the side of the exam table, and gave the dog a quiet command. "Tank, stay, guard." Tank sat immediately, his posture alert but calm, and his eyes tracked Nora as her mother helped her up onto the table. The girl kept one hand extended toward the dog the entire time, her fingers brushing his head, and Tank leaned into the touch, just enough to let her know he wasn't going anywhere. Dr. Patel moved through the exam with practiced efficiency, checking Nora's vitals, looking for injuries, asking gentle questions that Nora answered in whispers or nods. There were no visible signs of physical abuse, no bruises, no marks, but Callahan knew the damage Marsh had done went deeper than anything a medical exam could reveal. He'd shattered this child's ability to trust, to speak, to reach for help when she needed it most. And rebuilding that was going to take time, therapy, and a level of patience and care that Callahan could only hope Nora's family was equipped to provide. When the exam was finished, Dr. Patel stepped back and smiled at Nora. "You did great, sweetheart. Everything looks good. You're going to be just fine." She turned to Nora's mother, her expression more serious now. "I'd like to have our trauma counselor come in and talk with you before you leave, just to make sure you have the resources you need going forward. This kind of psychological manipulation, it's going to take time to process and heal from. But she's strong, and she has you. That's going to make all the difference." Nora's mother nodded, tears streaming down her face again, and she pulled her daughter into a tight hug. Nora clung to her, her face buried in her mother's neck, and Tank shifted closer, his head resting against Nora's knee. Callahan watched them, his chest tight, and felt Detective Raines' hand on his shoulder. "You did good today," she said quietly. "Both of you." Callahan looked down at Tank, at the dog who'd refused to follow standard procedure, who'd trusted his instincts over commands, who'd seen what no human could, and held the line until Nora felt safe enough to break her silence. "He did it," Callahan said. "I just backed him up." Raines smiled faintly. "That's what partners do." She glanced at her watch. "I need to get back to the station. We've got a long night ahead processing everything we pulled from Marsh's place. But I'll make sure you get a copy of the report. And Callahan, when this goes to trial, I'm going to need you and Tank to testify. The defense is going to try to argue that Nora was never in real danger, that Marsh was just a babysitter who got too attached. Tank's behavior, the way he positioned himself, the way he refused to let anyone override Nora's boundaries, that's going to be critical in proving the level of control Marsh had over her." Callahan nodded. "We'll be there." Raines left, and Callahan stayed in the doorway, watching as the trauma counselor arrived and began speaking quietly with Nora's mother. Nora sat on the table, her legs dangling, her hands still resting on Tank's head, and for the first time since Callahan had found her on that bench, she looked small. Not silent, not frozen, just small. A 6-year-old kid who'd been carrying a weight no child should ever have to bear. After a while, Nora's mother stood and walked over to Callahan, her face exhausted but grateful. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "If you hadn't found her, if Tank hadn't, she couldn't finish." Callahan shook his head. "You don't need to thank us, just take care of her. And if she needs Tank again, for therapy visits, for court, whatever, we'll be there." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes, and then she did something Callahan didn't expect. She crouched down beside Tank and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. Tank stood still, patient and steady, and let her hold him until she was ready to let go. When Nora was finally cleared to leave, Callahan walked them out to the parking lot, Tank pacing beside the wheelchair one last time. At the car, Nora's mother helped her into the back seat, and Nora looked out the window at Tank, her eyes wide and wet. Can I say goodbye?" she asked, her voice still so quiet Callahan almost missed it. "Of course," Callahan said, and he opened the car door wider, letting Tank step closer. Nora leaned out and wrapped her arms around Tank's neck, pressing her face against his fur the way her mother had, and whispered something Callahan couldn't hear. Tank's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate, and he licked the side of Nora's face gently before stepping back. Nora smiled, small, fragile, but real, and her mother closed the door carefully. As the car pulled away, Callahan stood in the parking lot with Tank at his side and watched until the taillights disappeared into the evening traffic. The dog sat down, his body finally relaxing, and Callahan rested his hand on Tank's head. "Good boy," he said quietly. "You did good, partner." Tank looked up at him, ears forward, and Callahan could have sworn the dog understood exactly what he meant. They'd done what they were supposed to do. They'd held the line. They'd given a terrified child the one thing she needed most. A presence that didn't demand, didn't force, didn't break her down any further. A presence that simply stayed. And in a world full of invisible traps and carefully constructed prisons, sometimes that was the only thing that mattered.